to the guest lecture series for the MA in Spirituality, Ecology and Mental Health. Real pleasure today to have Professor Naresh Singh join us. I'm really pleased to meet him during the INS conference at Waterford last summer. I heard him speak, so I know we're in for a really interesting conversation today. So let me formally welcome you and introduce you, Naresh. He is Professor and Executive Dean at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, Director of the Centre of Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality and Public Policy, and Co-Director of the Centre for Legal Empowerment of the Poor. I would take you through all the things that Naresh teaches and researches, but it's quite an extensive list. So perhaps I'll draw out that his research and courses include complexity and public policy, systems thinking and strategies for sustainable development, and applied spirituality. And I think they're the real things that interest us in terms of our course. He's a visiting professor and a scholar at many universities, including Harvard, and has been consultant advisor for the United Nations Development Programme, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the Pan American Health Organization. It's just such an incredible privilege to have such a man with international reputation join us today. And in our preamble, we've been sharing and talking about the idea that spirituality is something that is embodied and something that is so important to be in public policy. Naresh has just had his new book released in December, I think it was this year, Applied Spirituality and Sustainable Development Policy, which we will be getting into the library. So it's an exciting time for Naresh as well. So I'm going to sit back, I'm going to enjoy this, and I'm going to pass this over to you, Naresh. Welcome and really pleased to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Lee. Wonderful to be here with you. I'm assuming we have about an hour.
Absolutely, yes. Take your time.
So if I do about 40, 45 minutes max, and then we have a chance to chat a little bit. Okay.
That would be brilliant. Yes.
All right, let me just share my screen. I hope I can share. Let's see. Yeah.
That's it.
Okay. Right. So you can see the screen on the full screen, huh? Lee, is that good?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. Okay, so here we go. So what I want to talk about, and let me just clarify a few issues up front, and then we'll go into it. One is the focus of this talk is more on spirituality for public policy. As we all know, spirituality has a very long, thousands of years history, and people come at it from different ways of thinking and being. The most important point I have observed is that spirituality has been a kind of a private affair where people tend to look at spirituality as something that is personal and private. And when studied, it is studied in that kind of way of what it means for the individual. This work is different in that it looks at what it means for the public sphere, collective behavior, and not only individual. So in that sense, it links to public policy. But what we found as I considered a few years ago when I was starting this work, 4 or 5 years ago, I found that unless you anchored it into specific challenges, it's the implications, the real implications are not that easy to communicate. And so we thought we had a broad enough sphere when we talk about sustainable development policy to work with these ideas. I put the Anthropocene in inverted commas here because I don't know if you're aware, but the the Geological Union, the people who are responsible for naming this era, have just ended their meeting with a conclusion that there is not enough data and evidence for this era, this period of time, to be actually named the Anthropocene. So we all have been using it. They debated for 15 years and last week concluded that they are not naming it officially. So I use the inverted commas. I will use the word Anthropocene as a because we know what it means to us, but just to mention that it's not officially named as such. The spirituality we are talking about is secular, and by that we mean it does not require any faith or any belief system or any organized religion. So it's not based on any doctrine or dogma of any religion. That's why we call it secular spirituality, or another way is, in a way, transcendental secularity. One might think about it. While Ralph Waldo Emerson, who we all love to quote, um, put it in a very interesting way. This quote, I think, really emphasizes what we are working on. He says, as men's prayers are, of course, humans' prayers, but back in the day, men's prayers, not gender sensitive. As men's prayers are a disease of the will, so their creeds are a disease of the intellect. We take that pretty seriously. And we do think that belief systems and so on are not helpful in this work. So that's the kind of premise on which we are building this work. So some of the core problems, and what I'm doing in this, I'm going to root causes. Well, one can talk about causes, causes of climate change, causes of economic inequality. And then one can talk about the causes of the causes. And you go deeper down, and this work tries to go down a bit deeper. So I would say that the core problem for sustainable development is the recognition of the separation which humans feel from each other and from nature. That separation is the key challenge. It is what leads us to conflicts as well as overexploitation. We fail to recognize that we are one and the same. We share the same common consciousness. I'm quite happy to explain where that idea comes from if anyone is interested. So this kind of separation has led to an extractive and exploitative civilization, which one might call fossil fuel-driven capitalism. It is the dominant civilizational ethic in which progress and success are mainly based on material accumulation. Now, we all know this, I believe, but just going down to the core of what has to be changed. And I think what needs to be changed is this narrative. It might seem really difficult and an uphill battle, a long road, but I think that that's where it is. So most of public policy intervention programs start on the premise that separation is the reality from which we proceed, and then we attempt a reconciliation between society and nature. When you do that, I think you miss the boat. I did it for 25 years, so I am full of sympathy for those who still do it. I understand the way the world is, and 400 years of Newtonian science, or Newton, Descartes, and Bacon, one might say, has led us to this reductionist world in which we attempt to make sense. But that is the core of the problem, and it leads us to ask what I might call the wrong questions. Well, it's not really wrong questions, but we focus on symptoms. So we talk of things like consumption, pollution, species extinction, and so on. And we make public policy to address all of those problems, and we teach how to analyze all of those problems. But we don't go deeper. What is causing that? I am arguing that pollution and all of that is are, if you like, they are symptoms of the problem rather than the core problem. Put another way, Gus Speth, James Gustav Speth, who was the administrator of the UN Development Program, professor at Yale, dean of forestry, and head of the World Resources Institute in the US and so on, and who was my boss in the UNDP, who hired me there at one point. He put it very well. He says, and a quote I use commonly, he says that I used to think that pollution, species extinction, climate change, and so on were the biggest environmental problems of the world, and that 30 years of good science would solve them. And then he concludes, but I was wrong. The greatest problems of the environment, by extension, sustainable development, are greed, apathy, and selfishness. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Or rather, he says, and what we need is a cultural and spiritual revolution, and we scientists don't know how to do that. So when you ask the wrong question, you can't get to the core problem. It's like asking, I mean, I pose this question, how do I become spiritual? People keep asking that question, you know, including my students. How do I become spiritual? What is the best path to become spiritual? And that, of course, that evokes a bit of a smile, because you do not become spiritual. If you have gone this road, you know that you are spiritual. It's just how you get out of the conditioning and reveal the spirituality. That's what really is the issue. So quite a bit of work to be done. That leads us to the first big challenge, and well, challenge or opportunity, one might say, is understanding our own true nature. And we each have, you know, to walk that path in order to be able to understand it deeply. Otherwise, we become part of the problem if it is only intellectualized. And the way it has been done, well, the way I follow, and it might be there might be other paths. The one after 30 years of, not 30, but 20 years of meditation and other contemplative practices, I find, I'm not saying that everybody would, but I find this direct path, what is called Advaita Vedanta, to be the path that is most helpful. And I was able to get closer to that reality much faster than my 20 years of different kinds of meditation. And that is to inquire, who am I? Simply, who am I? And you find out very quickly what you are not. So you are able to establish quite quickly that you are not the body in reality, because clearly, if I'm saying my body, my ability to say my body is coming from some source. I'm not my mind. So the yogis, in their meditative ways, use the Sanskrit words neti, neti, meaning not this, not this. They find out that they are not a whole range of things. The Buddhist practice is the same. So that does not really lead to an answer per se. You just come to what you do not, what you are not. And it leads to a place, a great spot, one might say. It leads to the end of the questioner. Who is it that is questioning, who am I? And in fact, what you would find, and it's a beautiful thing to experience it yourself, is that it leads from you considering yourself as something and then to nothing, which in the Buddhist tradition is emptiness, shunyata. And then when the walls, the narrow walls of our consciousness, where we think of ourselves as independent conscious beings, it shifts to, it dissolves, and you can see yourself as part of the universal consciousness. So that's the process. But I mean, in the course that I teach here, we mention it, and I get other spiritual teachers to come in and do a few classes. I don't teach that. I prefer to focus on the link with public policy. So then you end up with having to interpret your own being. So this does not negate the fact that in the mind body world, in the manifest physical world, we are clearly individuals. We don't deny that. but you recognize that deeper down you have a deeper reality. That's all that we are saying. So that's a little intro into understanding our own true nature. That understanding leads to a non-dual understanding of the world, or the idea of oneness. This is the important implication. Oneness with nature and with each other. And we recognize that this separation is a fiction. It's a kind of an illusion. And as I mentioned, it's not denying our individuality, but recognizing the underlying oneness. And what you also realize is that the origin of the ego that we think is ourselves, that's something that gets insulted. Somebody says something that's not so nice to us, we feel insulted or hurt. Check and see who is being hurt. And you quickly get down to understanding the nature of the ego, which clearly does not exist in reality. But the conditioning is so powerful, not only the conditioning since childhood, but even biological evolution as we evolved in the jungles has conditioned us for survival in a way that we ended up thinking of ourselves as this something and this sort of ego that we believe is so real. And recent scientific work makes this quite clear. If you take Robert Sapolsky or several other authors, Behave, or The Way Things Are, Ian McGilchrist on The Master and the Emissary, a lot of psychiatric, Western, solid scientific research leads to the same conclusion. And in our work, we draw from the wisdom traditions, but we draw from quantum physics and modern neuroscience to ensure that we have a convergence of thinking in order that we know that we are academically, at least, rigorous enough to be able to teach and to publish in this area. So what are the public policy implications? Once we have that understanding, and clearly it takes quite a bit to get there, but you can. It doesn't need any special skills. We are all deeply spiritual at our core, whether we know it or not. So policy implications. The first policy implication is that the default purpose of public policy, which is typically GDP per capita, so countries make public policy and they measure GDP per capita growth. These days, India is extremely proud and boasting of its GDP per capita, which is about 7%, 6.8 for a few years, and projected to continue. As you know, India is now the fifth largest economy in the world and projected to be number 3 quite soon. So it continues to be the major measure not only of developing countries, but developed as well. So the question then is, what about if we consider public policy whose goal and objective is greater love, harmony, inner development, compassion, etc., which flow naturally from a deeper understanding of our own true nature? So that's one big policy implication. The second big one is ethical public policy. Now, ethical public policy has been with us from a very long time, but it has been largely utilitarian or deontological, based on moral duty and moral right and wrong. And all of that is good and should be kept. The shift that we are recognizing now is the shift from utilitarian and deontological to ontological ethics. That is the ethics of being, or if you like, the ethics of life support systems, the ethics of our core being itself. And there is work done on ontological ethics, not as much as the other two, far from that, but drawing from the work of Swami Vivekananda and others. It's coming largely from the Advaita Vedanta school, where they have discussed ontological ethics. That's another big shift. How will ethical public policy shift? Then we can political economy, which we all know from Political Economy 101, works with the politics of having, who gets what, how. And most political economy continues to be that. But when we reflect on what we are as human beings, not human havings or human doings, but human beings, we think the time has come to consider political economy of being. And work is being done on this. There's a book written by a colleague and friend a few years ago who has a chapter in our book that we just put out, Thomas Legrand from the south of France. Thomas wrote this book called The Politics of Being. So the work is happening now. And we need, so that's the third shift, moving to a politics of being. The fourth one is leadership and public management will need to shift from dominant transactional modes to more transformational modes, or leadership, if you wish. And I wrote a chapter in the book that we edited on spiritual leadership, not spiritual leaders, but leadership, which is based on principles of authentic leadership, servant leadership, participatory leadership styles, and so on. They are, and now the idea of spiritual leadership in that sense is becoming recognized as a field of leadership studies. Fifth, institutions as rules of the game need to shift from designs which are based on competition and confrontation. And indeed, the underlying incentives need to shift to cooperation, adaptation, and learning. The big one, I'm challenging my colleagues, and I have colleagues who work on game theory, and we have, quite a piece of scientific and mathematical complement to this work. So I asked them to consider in their game theory work, how do you move from games that you play to win to playing games to continue to play? And they are now grappling with that. So we are at the philosophical stage of that one. How do you shift from games that you play to win to playing games to continue to play? How do you shift from power as a zero-sum game to power as a positive-sum game, in which you don't have to be wrong for me to be right? You don't have to lose power for me to gain power, because the power game can grow. The pie can grow, right? The cake. And there are ways of doing this, but our institutions have been based upon this reductionist, deterministic worldview in which they are all designed for competition. And our capitalism, civilizational ethic drives it that way as well. Now, I think many people argue that we have known this now for a while, but we are saying that it derives more clearly from this core of what we truly are, that spiritual core. Now, while all of that is happening, these five public policy shifts based upon the understanding I outlined at the beginning, yes, we have to continue with the tinkering that we have been doing. And I was involved myself for 25, 30 years, started the climate change work from 1990, helped in the negotiation of the Climate Change Convention in 1992. I led delegations from the small island states. So PhDs is in environmental science. So yes, I recognize the important work that we need to continue to do in donut economics, circular economics, technology for clean, green energy, and all of this stuff. Post-growth and the work of Tim Jackson in the UK on prosperity without growth, and all of that must continue. But my argument in this work is that is tinkering at the public policy edges and will not take us where we need to go. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of this work is complemented by our work and other work on scientific insights, what one might call modern science. So we find complexity theory and complex adaptive systems thinking to be very helpful and supportive is very different from Newtonian science, or if you like, neoclassical economics. If you continue to be in the neoclassical economic mode of thought, then you will be into the circular economics or donut economics, still using neoclassical economics, and there you will be at the edges and dealing with symptoms. So you need to make that shift, because we question the issues of the naive assumptions of neoclassical economics, like humans exist for maximizing their self-utility, their own maximizing their own self-interest, that we are all identical to each other in the physical world, which we clearly are not, that we have full information sets, and that we are perfectly rational. Those are clearly naive assumptions. I think we will all agree. Complexity theory, complexity economics, and so on, helps us to see the world, which I think is closer to the reality that we observe. And the role of consciousness is much easier to understand in that frame compared to a more mechanical clockwork kind of universe. The other source of science that we use is quantum-like frameworks. Again, quantum-like frameworks help us a lot in overcoming the limitations of the world that I just described as mechanical, clockwork, or neoclassical. And that is now, there's a whole field of work called quantum social sciences, work going on in human cognition, decision making, financial decision making, and so on. And I have colleagues, one of my colleagues, very actively researching in this area. In fact, graduate of a UK university, University of Glasgow, I believe. And now we are actively doing this. The other area, as I mentioned, is cognitive neuroscience. We draw from the work of people like Don Hoffman. His book is, I think, really influential. His book in 2018 called The Case Against Reality, or How Humans Evolved in a Way That They Cannot Understand Underlying Reality. So quite fascinating. In other words, evolution had to mask reality from us in order for us to survive in the harsh environment in which we did. Or if you take Ian McGilchrist, another UK based Irish, I guess, I'm not sure now. McGilchrist's two big books, two famous books, The Master and His Emissary, in which he looks at the left brain, rational, dominant, left brain grabbing, leading his explanation of how the dominant civilizational force we have now is due to the left brain domination. And the right brain, which is much more holistic in approach, is not that it is just, if you like, more feminine or softer or something of that kind. It's a more holistic aspect of the brain. That's why he calls his book The Master and the Emissary. The right brain is supposed to be the master, the left brain the emissary, but the emissary became the master in our current civilization. And so one can draw from cognitive neuroscience, and it complements this really nicely, and we feel more comfortable in the rigorous work that's ongoing. But if you didn't believe me in terms of the work I cited from Hoffman and McGilchrist, I think you will believe if Einstein said it, right? So he says the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind a faithful servant. That's all good, right? Problem, we have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. Same argument. And that's what we are saying. Come on, guys, let's wake up. So then the importance of these new insights is that they should help us to make this transition from the dominant, linear, deterministic, reductionist kind of Newtonian worldview, the left hemisphere worldview, to a more balanced right hemisphere, left hemisphere approach as human beings, and we are showing a way to deal with that. The shifts we are talking about in terms of using complexity theory and so on will help us as well to deal with the wicked policy problems of the world, such as climate change and poverty and several of the sustainable development goals. And with the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world in which the traditional paradigm doesn't work very well. So this convergence of science and spirituality, I think, will help us make the arguments and advance our work. Now, a few thoughts, and we should wrap up in about 10 minutes or so to have a discussion and questioning of this. How do we get from where we are to where the vision that I'm painting? And this is the one that really is where the energy has to be placed. How do we do this thing in practical ways? The current paradigm is so entrenched that most people will say this is worse than a dream. It's not even as realistic in a dream, much less making it work in practice in the entrenched nature of the thinking. So I outline a few points that I think will help us to get there. The first one is that we need to move to what we are calling now integral public policy. That phrase is not in the literature as yet. We have just written a paper, and trying to get this published is not going to be easy. We've been rejected twice already, two good journals, but they want more and more changes. The thing is that these journals, public policy journals, have never published anything like this. So we'll see where it goes, but we believe it has merit. I'll tell you what I'm talking about in a minute. Integral public policy is one big shift in the public policy world. The second big one is the transformation of social science curricula. That's another big one. I think we will probably succeed better there, including policy and leadership courses that is based on this new scientific thinking and on the deeper understanding of where we are. Then how do we scale values? So we are accustomed to geographic scaling. So we know on social scaling, we want larger numbers of people to become involved in what we do. And so we scale wider scaling. But we need now to be scaling deeper. And I have found the idea of using fractals really helpful. Fractals being the repetition of similar patterns at different scales. It gives us great insights, and it's derived from complexity theory. And it is linked to spirituality because it deals with values which we need to scale. So it's not just scaling now in terms of getting wider in the geographical sense or the physical sense, but going deeper. And the final point one might say in this strategy would be using the power of stories. Narrative public policy might get us there. And we are now going to introduce a new course in our school on narrative public policy. It's being taught in some other universities already. But we need to, it's not in enough places. We all know the power of stories, but it's not as yet being used enough in public policy work and helping us to get out of the dominant mechanistic world paradigm. I think stories will help us get there. So for the integral public policy, just to give you a little insight, we are using Ken Wilber's integral quadrants. I find this simple but powerful. He looks at a holistic view of the world by starting with individual and collective as two ways in which humans engage with reality, with the physical world. And we do it either as individuals or as collectives. And we have an internal and an external. Of course, in public policy, we have always only focused on the external. All right, but we have brought in a little bit. So the bottom right, where we have systems, is where public policy has always been. The collective external, i.e. in the society, in the public. And there we have studied and worked with systems and processes and agreements and measurements, all the good public policy work that we have had going on from the time of Harold Lasswell, 1934, or whenever Lasswell started policy sciences. More recently, we've brought in the internal collective, i.e. culture, into public policy, shared values, purpose, norms, and history, anthropologists, ethnography, and so on. So that's working and needs to be developed more culture into the public policy sphere. More recently as well, like 15, 20 years, maybe more, Richard Taylor and Cass Sunstein and Skinner, not Skinner, the one that wrote the book on animal spirits, Schiller rather. So behavioral economics has become a big thing. Behavioral science and public policy is now published as a book and so on. So the external behavior can come into the public policy. We are doing it already. Culture is coming in. The one box that's not coming in well is consciousness studies, spirituality issues, internal, like someone said, we have seen the enemy and it's us. So we are able to do all of this other stuff, but not in our internal, not coming into public policy. That's the work, the way we are bringing in now. So two challenges here. One is to bring in consciousness or spirituality into public policy, and secondly, how to make these integrated well in an operational public policy. And that's what we have written up in a paper now and hope to get published soon. Scaling, as I mentioned, fractal scaling. The issue is that we have a lot of scaling out. So we replicate and disseminate innovative programs, products, ideas. We've been doing all of that for a long time over a wider geographical area. Scaling deep, which is transforming the quality of social relations and so on, hearts and minds and values and cultural practices need more attention, and that's what we are saying. And this heuristic of fractals is really interesting. I find really interesting, and I'll show you why in this little schema. See, as an individual level, if you want to influence change and share your values, which hopefully are based on your own inner spirituality and your own shifts that you have made in coming closer to that reality, you might influence 10 people, 10 to the 0, right? Or which is 10 people. 10 to the 1, 10 to the 0 will be 1, right? So 10 to the 1, and so on. And what happens is that as you are able to work in these ever expanding circles in a hierarchical approach, from individual to family to networks to community, village, neighborhood, meta community, and going on and on to country and global, at the global level, if you get this kind of fractal self-repeating patterns, you can go to really large numbers like 10 to the 10 and so on. So it gives us a way of thinking about how to scale values, which has not had enough attention. That's the good point. So the other point that I made was using stories, right? Narrative public policy. I think this really is going to be a powerful tool to change the dominant narrative, which is, I would argue, the big problem we have in public policy and in sustainable development work. If you want to remain at the edges, in donut economics and circular economy and clean and renewable energies, of course, that's important. But that's not going to take us where I am arguing we need to go, or we are arguing, the small group of us. So NPF is good. NPF means the narrative policy framework. And what it does is it looks at policy just like a play on a stage. So you have the setting on the stage, you have the characters, you look at public policy as the setting, which is typically the context or the environment in which the social environment in which the policy challenge exists. You look at the characters, who is trying to make change, who is against the change. And just like you have in any play, in any story, you look at the plot, you look at the moral of the story, and you do an analysis of that in this way. And there are now examples in which the narrative policy framework has looked at climate change, and it's looked at stories through egalitarianism, hierarchy, individualism. and they contain different heroes, villains, victims, plots, and so on. I think this kind of approach might really resonate with people more and more. At the end of the day, we are really storytellers as humans. We know that, right? But we need to use it more and more. In fact, when you work with systems, I've come to the conclusion that all our fancy mathematics still needs a degree of reductionism, and perhaps only stories are truly holistic in nature. Just two slides more, then I'm wrapping up now. There are other ways to make the link to what we are talking about, you know. So we have always had IQ. In the material world, rational thinking is important, but we have ended up, because of our materialistic civilization, treasuring rational or IQ, intelligence quotient, what I think and thinking more than everything else. So to the point that we have gone overboard, and we treasure thinking beyond what it can do. And most thinking are based on reductionist or analytical approaches. Until 30, 40 years ago, Goldman and others looked at emotional quotient. Putnam brought in social capital. That's now really well established. Social capital in public policy, economic theory, and so on. And the measure of EQ became really important. What are we measuring now? Feelings. So that became respectable. For a long time, it was not what I feel. So we have, in terms of intelligence, and we know we have multiple intelligences, I think that's well established. What I think, well established. What I feel, well established. Not well established, who am I? What am I? That would appear like the most important of the three, but is coming last, but not too late, I hope. So spiritual quotient is now being measured, is now being, Dana Zohar has come up with this, Vernon, Mark Vernon in the UK just put out a book 2 years ago called Seven Steps to Spiritual Intelligence. Dana Zohar has a book on spiritual capital and one on spiritual intelligence, in which they have measures and so on. This, unfortunately, if you don't measure something, you can't talk about it in economic decision making and public policy, right? That's the way the world is. So that's why it is so important. Although people say that you are going to shortchange spirituality by moving to that, I am quite pragmatic on this note, and I think we need to go there in order to show that, look, we are serious and engaging with the real world. And finally, on leadership, bringing together spiritual intelligence, rational intelligence, and emotional intelligence would be the basis of transpersonal leadership, the basis of ethical behavior. We should be looking at performance measurements. Some corporations are already bringing in all three of the intelligences in their interviews with candidates: rational, emotional, and now spiritual. And then hopefully this helps us to move as well to a more caring and sustainable civilization. So that's the way I see that coming in, and that's what I wanted to share. So we'll leave it at that, and then happy to engage and to discuss. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Naresh. Thank you very much. Wow,
You.
what a tour de force and the wonderful narrative that we shared there. I've got some questions
Mhm.
burning away at me, but I'm gonna throw it open to other people and give everyone the opportunity to be able to have conversation with such an esteemed colleague. So if there's any questions out there before I kick off, feel free
Let me
to
stop
ask
sharing so
away.
I can see people again. Here we are. Yeah.
Oh, bugger. Oh, your
Okay, there,
microphone was on with
Rosie.
the. Sorry. Sorry. My phone's playing up, so I keep losing everybody every now and then. I didn't realise my microphone was on.
That's okay. That's okay.
You guys mean it was that bad? There was no sense in this thing?
No, I don't know. Personally, I don't know where to begin. I'm going to let Lee kick off with some questions, and then I'm going to gather my thoughts as I go through my copious notes on it. Because I have made lots of notes.
I was just going to say I was writing as you were talking. I was writing notes down as an idea would come up, because of just parallels with things. And I'd watched I'd watched a talk a few days ago, and it was by a CIA operative, and he was talking about how he was trained for like 18 years and was in CIA for that length of time. And one of the things that he was talking about was motivation. And he said that there were sort of four main motivations that you're taught that to impact everybody. And it's rice. So one of them is rewards, ideology, coercion, and ego. And he said, and out of all of them, ideology is the most, is the top one. That's the way, you tap into somebody's ideology. He said you can manipulate them and motivate them, because manipulation and motivation are of the same coin. He said you can motivate them or manipulate them to do anything. He said, and then after that, you've got rewards, then ego, and the very last thing is coercion. And as you were talking, I was thinking that this goes straight to the ideology, because you're creating an ideology through the narrative that you speak and you share. And I was thinking about how important, definitely how important it is, the narrative that you were talking about there, changing the narrative policy, because actually the narrative policy has been changed the other way around. So what we're hearing are the stories that we've always been hearing, so the competition, the capitalistic or the socialistic or the sort of communistic. So we've been hearing those stories for so long. How I don't want to say how long do you think it's going to take, but do you feel that because but at the same time, there's an element of me that believes that it can actually take a much, if there are ways, especially that the model that was created at the very end, the Venn diagram, the way that all of those come together, and also the fact that innately we are wanting something more, and that's what I found really inspiring from your talk, was the fact that actually I think that once the narrative is out there, once the narrative is getting to the core of something, there actually is going to be a very quick change, because it's something that will resonate with everybody, at their core. Whereas all the other ideologies, they have probably used rewards, tapped into the ego and coercion in order to get what they want and create that ideology in the first place. So yeah, I'm very excited for listening to you.
Wonderful. Thanks for that feedback. Quick reaction. When people realize that they have been laboring under an ideology which is not necessarily in their best interest, maybe they will start to take action. But the thing is that, of course, people are now in deep slumber. And that's why we have to talk about the waking up. Life is like they are so indoctrinated by this capitalistic civilizational ethic is the only thing we know. So that's that waking up. But for the individuals to wake up, I think will take a very long time, and we don't have that time. Hopefully it will happen, like you say, optimistically, that when they realize it, they will. And that is why I think they link to public policy. The public policy can have large-scale shifts much faster. And that's why we're doing that work. So together, if these work together, bottom up and top down, maybe we have a good chance to wake up in time. But thanks for that feedback. Great.
Beautifully put, Romy. And yeah, actually, that was well in the space of what I was thinking.
Oh.
It's there's things listening to what you spoke there about Naresh, and I completely agree with public policy and how Romy so insightfully got to the point of ideology as a tipping point. That's how I interpreted what you were saying there. How do we and thinking about the way politics is going, and I am going to turn it in on the UK, where politics at the moment is all very black and white. The choices between different parties is deteriorating, i.e., there's very little choice. The policies are sort of clumping together, and we're facing perhaps this is actually a good sign. We seem to be facing a greater clampdown to express publicly through protests and having voice as collective. Um, that's being curtailed in the UK, which perhaps means that there's some sense of change or fear that the status quo might be disrupted. How then do we politically and collectively then start to be able to have that pressure and voice? It's almost like we're missing some sort of political expression that is based around these ideas that we all agree with and we're all desperately wanting to have in the world. And I know education is part of it. That's that's part of what we do as a course. I suppose I'm not politically I don't have a background in politics. How do you shift this political world in this direction?
Yeah, very good. So in order to answer that, all we need to do is to go back and see what are the sources of public policy change. How does public policy get changed anyway? So we have a few sources of public policy. The most common one in democracies is political party manifestos. So a political party is campaigning to become a government, and they come up with a manifesto. Hopefully people vote not only because they like the appearance of the leader, but because they truly believe in the policies being advocated, right? So political party manifesto is one source. Social media is another source. Well, all media, social media, of course, very dominant nowadays, but print media, TV, radio, whatever sources are also sources. Then we have our all good social movements where people come together and protest or campaign for change, right? So these are all sources. Of course, the other big one, perhaps the most important source of public policy change is crisis. Humans don't tend to change until they have a major crisis, right? Even when they are facing a crisis, they don't tend to change, like climate change, these wicked policy problems. So if we identify the sources of change of public policy like we can do, then how do you get this onto the agenda is the next question. And to do that, you need to begin to identify champions in the system. Hopefully in academia, we can find a few. Hopefully in local level, churches, wherever they are. I don't know. They might be local government. I find people in very strange places who are seized with this agenda, but never knew what to do about it because it had not been articulated in a systematic way. I met the chief minister of the state in which I am right now in Haryana, which is I don't know, maybe a state, in India, everything is huge. So Haryana must be a state of nearly 100 million people or something. The secretary to the chief minister, who is also a Sufi singer, which I didn't know. I met him when he retired. He was visiting our university, and I had a chat with him. I said, do you think this bunch of fringe or naive ideas I have, will they resonate with public servants, hard-nosed bureaucrats? And he says, even if they don't resonate, we have to make them resonate. Otherwise, we don't have a country. So he was very seized and he was very senior. When a top leader like that picks up on the idea, the others beneath in the bureaucracy will fall in line. That's how bureaucracies function. So those are a few thoughts on how this shift might take place and where we need to look for power shifts.
And there's lots of hope that I hear in that. And of course, like what we're doing, where people are exploring who I am and how I connect to the wider world, and how I can bring that into my life and do something in service of something more than me. I get the sense that every small act that we do, every opportunity that we have to give something back to our community to make this world, let's normally call it a better place, to bring some care, compassion, and love into the space, is all sending those ripples out, as well as how we then perhaps come together. You know, this is sort of part of my second question. Um, you know, when I listened to what you're saying, it just reminded me of, I don't know, back 2015 or something. I was participating in the MITEX U Lab with Otto Sharma and his work. And again, you know, there's so much good work going on there. And it's there are these pockets of this good work. How do we then, what is it that causes this work to unite? You know, I look at some other organizations like capitalism, how corporations have come together and have made very strong connections between each other and have these dynamic ways of supporting each other, even though they're in competition. How do we sort of leverage the same sort of connections and coming together to increase that 10 to the power more?
Right. Excellent question. So the theory behind it is called network theory, which comes from complexity theory as well. So network theory gives us some good insights, but at the theoretical level, right? It might also give some practical insights. So that's one. From my experience, you know, all partnerships and networking among various little pockets of change, even though they are in the same kind of business, the humans being what we are, if you can't answer the question, what is in it for me, it doesn't seem to ignite, right? Because Otto Sharma he's done a lot of great work. I've been following his thinking and his work for a long time as well, theory, U, and so on, and learning from the future is really exciting. And if you notice in my slide, I say, how do we get there from here? That's not by chance. It's because I'm thinking, how do you start with the future you envision and then work to get there rather than try incrementally to move from here to get there? We'll never get there. You know, and it's emerging in the future, as Otto Scharmer says in his work as well. So I think it is strategizing in terms of finding champions of change, drawing from network theory, and finding the sort of practical motivations that can help us to go there. When people are young, or just to be really pragmatic and the point of being mean in this statement, when young academics, for example, are building their career, you know, they want to get their stuff published. They don't really want to partner and network and so on for fear their ideas might be picked up by someone else. More see when you reach my level of being, you know, having gone through life already, it really doesn't matter. I really want the ideas to ignite. And if you get a bunch of people who really don't have vested interest, self-interest in the equation, they might be able to help it happen. So those are some sort of roughshod ideas, but hopefully that will help us to work.
Thank you. And I think perhaps these moments of coming together like this are all part of that package and network. I hope we can continue to collaborate. I've noticed at the time it's pushing on, and I appreciate you're a busy man, and thank you for everyone. So I'll start to wrap this up. Thank you ever so much, Naresh. I think that's really fired me up. I love coming together into the energy of these spaces and hearing
But
this
should
work.
we check if Angela had anything to Angela,
I mean, there's so much. I mean, I can only echo what Romy and Lee have both said. I'm particularly enamored by the scaling process. And
I have the paper there. I gave you the link. It's written by O'Brien, 2023, and the title has in it fractal scaling. So if you Google that, you should get it. Otherwise, I can send it if you want to read it. Yeah.
And the other part of it, which really, really spoke to me, was the storytelling, because it's bizarre, isn't it, how you things all coincide. But I've read the most beautiful book. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Make It Stick.
Yeah.
And it is about the power of storytelling, why certain things work. And that, to me, as you said, by networking, by finding ambassadors, by finding those who are empowered to empower others, that story then becomes the motive, because people feel as though they will make a difference. And I think that's the biggest thing. We've lost our spirituality. We don't know that we are spiritual beings.
Right.
And it's about reconnecting, not necessarily directed, you are spiritual, you need to know this, but by self-discovery. And just a feeling of empowerment, I think, will give that people the opportunity to start believing again. As you said, they're mostly in a deep state of slumber. It's almost like we've gone transdimensional, and all these people are in little pods in their own little world, like we see in the movies, just cruising through time-space continuum without really realizing what they're going through. And we need to go and knock on their little windows and go, time to wake up, love, have a cup of tea, smell the roses, and let's move on, shall we? So yeah, no, lovely. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. That was lovely.
Most welcome. I leave one thought with you, Lee, because your course does have mental health in it. I was talking to a psychiatrist who was visiting us from the US here at our campus. We were having lunch, and he's in fact the brother of our vice chancellor. So we had a good chat, and I said to him, my problem with Western psychology and psychiatry is that you are trying to cure a self that does not exist. This imaginary self that you're working with is imaginary, isn't it? And he looks at me and he says, you hit the nail on the head, Naresh. I'm trying to do that. How do we slowly transcend that self? And that's becoming part of our practice now. I said, and then I have nothing else to say. I'm delighted to hear that Western psychiatry is headed there. And a lot of the mental health issues that people work with are in fact based upon a fiction. That I thought I'd mention that to you in case someone is working with that fiction in your course. For what it's worth.
Beautifully put. I shall, if you don't mind, I might beg, borrow, and steal that one and regurgitate. Thank you. I think, again, it's this difference between cause and symptoms. And I think, a lot of what we keep doing is natural symptoms to much deeper causes, and we've got to get to those deeper causes. And that's what you were speaking to today. As we're really pleased that you've come and shared your time with us.
Wonderful. No, it's a pleasure. Take care, and I look forward to receiving a link or the recording or something.
Absolutely. And I will send you a paper that might interest you. There's a recent one with Rogers and Dan McAdam on analysis of the hero's journey in a therapeutic setting, and that just might resonate with what you were talking about there on the narrative policy. So I look forward to hearing more and sharing more now. You take care, have a great weekend, and look after yourself.
Thanks,
guys.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.